Greetings, everyone, and welcome to THE507, Lecture 10b, where we look at the roles of women in the New Testament, passages about the roles of women, instances from the Gospels and other stories which illustrate what women did, how they were involved, and also passages, especially in the epistles, which sometimes specify rules for women, and so on. As you will all be well aware, the roles of women were controversial in the ancient world just as they are today. So we begin our survey by thinking about roles of women in the ancient world more broadly, so that we can put the New Testament passages and Jesus' interaction with women or Paul's comments in his letters, so that we can put those into a bit more context and have some sense of where they were typical, where they were atypical. It is very hard in short compass to give a balanced presentation of the question of how women were viewed and what roles they had in the ancient world. So please bear with me as I summarize, and bear in mind there are exceptions to everything I say here, and we could devote a whole semester easily to just the roles of women in the ancient world, and we could explore each of these issues in great detail. But we've got to get to the New Testament, and so we've got to survey things sort of briskly. And we can start with the unhappy fact that in the ancient world, broadly speaking, women were not viewed positively. Again, we will give exceptions, but this is overwhelmingly true. And we almost have to put out of our minds what I think most of us have today as an inherent sense of the equality of the sexes. Ancients just did not share that assumption. Even at the level of biology, at the level of psychology, however you want to look at it, they assumed women were inferior versions of the human. For a famous passage from Plato, and this prayer is also sometimes ascribed to other ancient Greek philosophers, Socrates or Thales. Lots of sources say Plato used to pray to God, "God, I thank you that you made me a Greek, not a barbarian, that you made me free and not a slave, and that you made me a man and not a woman." Now, in some ways we think of early Christianity as taking shape in two cultural contexts, that of the Greco-Roman world more broadly, but also of a subculture, of a special religion, that is, of Judaism. So, how can we contrast this view of Plato with the prayer of, let's say, Rabbi Judah? Rabbi Judah's prayer, as recorded in a few different early rabbinic sources, says, "God, I thank you that you made me a Jew, not a Gentile, free, not a slave, and a man, not a woman." You can see that all that has changed is the cultural valence of being Greek. And for Rabbi Judah, what's culturally valuable, religiously valuable, is that he's a Jew, not a Gentile. Whereas for Plato, it was a Greek, not a barbarian. Both agree it's good to be free, not slave. Both agree it's good to be man, not woman. And if we flesh this out a bit more, the truth is we would see that the same sorts of opinions we have here are echoed and amplified, perhaps, throughout the whole Hellenistic tradition. And so, for instance, Aristotle, who writes important treatises on friendship, goes out of his way to make clear you can't really have friendship between men and women. So if you've seen the movie When Harry Met Sally, they take up this topic. And in Harry Met Sally, they conclude men and women can't ever really be friends because some sort of romantic attraction will inevitably rear its head. That's not Aristotle's logic. Aristotle says there's no friendship between men and women. Why? Well, because women are so far inferior to men in their capacity for rationality, in their capacity for virtue, that it's just would be weird. It's friendship between unequals is inherently unstable and unsatisfying. It's not profitable. Again, that sort of attitude can be echoed by lots of Jewish voices from roughly the time of Jesus and early Christianity. So Philo of Alexandria, whom we've had occasion to quote at several times in this unit, really speaks quite negatively about women And Philo, in his vast writings that have survived for us, it's almost unremittingly negative. Women are irrational and symbols of passion. That means emotion. They're governed by their emotions, their lustfulness. This is true of Greek and Roman texts as well. The Essenes gave up on marriage altogether because why? Women just can't be trusted to stick out their marriage vows. They're too governed by their lusts. Josephus and so on. I want to say a word of caution here, and I do want to give one of these exceptions I've mentioned. And here's my word of caution. It's one thing to not have a perfectly accurate view of the Greco-Roman world, and it's another to have an imperfect view of ancient Judaism for this reason. Christian scholars and Christian preachers have, unfortunately, often taken some ancient Jewish views, let's say negative about women as well as negative about other things, and have used this to paint ancient Judaism quite negatively. And this has contributed to Christian anti-Semitism. And so on the one hand, there's no way to say that Philo of Alexandria has a particularly happy view of women. But we want to be really cautious about contrasting Christian roles for women and views of women with Jewish ones, if in any way that plays into anti-Semitism. So to illustrate this, we'll just give an example of one of the sayings from an early rabbinic text, the Mishnah, which can be quoted to illustrate what a terrible view the rabbis had of women. And this is a quotation. Every man who teaches his daughter Torah is as if he taught her promiscuity. You know what? You might as well teach her to be a prostitute so soon as you teach her to read the Bible. And this sort of thing can be quoted out of context as if this is the only view the rabbis held, whereas in fact, this very passage from the Mishnah, the preceding quotation, is a different view. Ben Azai says, a man ought to give his daughter a knowledge of Torah. And furthermore, there are a couple, not enough, but a couple famous women sages like Bruria, married to Rabbi Meir, who in various traditions is this courageous rabbinic sage who engages in halakhic dispute and corrects a couple of the rabbi's views, and so on and so forth. So there are exceptions, and we don't want to caricature, in particular, we don't want to caricature a Jewish view of women in the ancient world. That said, it's useful to restate that ancients really thought women weren't fully human. And we could draw a sort of chart which would say on the upper end, there are free adult male citizens of high social standing. They have proper minds and they can govern their passions. They can think rationally. They're fully formed humans. And on the other end there's a couple ways to be lower on this scale. It's to be female, that's lower, but female but free. Or to be a male but to be a slave. Or to be a male but to be sexually passive. Or to be a eunuch, or to be a child. In different ways, all of these different categories are contrasted in ancient Greek and Roman texts with being a free adult male. And what you find on this lower end of the scale is people who just can't think straight, who are governed by their passions. And so Aristotle will even say, a slave and a female and a child, what they broadly have in common is that the deliberative part of their mind, the part that can reason and make decisions, is simply not there in one way or another. A slave doesn't have it at all, he thinks. Females have it, yeah, but not without control. Children have it, but they don't really have control over it. So, there we have sort of a backdrop against which we can think about ways Jesus and the early Christians interacted with women, roles women played in early Christianity. One of the striking things about early Christianity is the sheer prominence of women, both in Jesus' ministry and in the earliest movement more broadly. It's often been remarked by historians of the ancient world that there is no known movement in which women played such diverse and such active roles. For what it's worth, it's interesting to note that the closest that any other movement attests is that of the Epicureans. Epicurus actually did hold that friendship between men and women was possible, and women in Epicurean communities were given a bit more authority and a bit more prominent roles. But in the New Testament, we will look at some of these passages more closely. We just note here that Jesus has women among his followers. There are women in prominent points in his life, so they alone come to witness his crucifixion. They are the first ones to be witnesses of the resurrection. That's really striking. And there are these famous episodes and stories. So here we have an artistic illustration of Jesus and the woman caught in adultery. But of course, that's just one of many, the Samaritan woman, the stories of Mary Magdalene, and these stories multiply and expand. We can look at, taken almost at random, a passage from the Apostle Paul. And Paul is often viewed as a bad guy when it comes to women. We'll look at some of those passages later. But here we just note at the end of Romans, where Paul has this really long meet and greet. So-and-so says hi, so-and-so says hi, please greet so-and-so. There's a ton of names. And among the things that's interesting is how many of these names are the names of women. Phoebe, Prisca, Mary, Junia, Tryphena, Tryphosa, Rufus, his mother, a mother also to me, Julia, his sister, so on and so forth. This is really prominent. That's a lot of women, and including women in leading roles. Now, arguably, what gave them this, the theological basis for this sort of role, would be a passage like we get in Galatians 3:28. And this is another passage that we're going to revisit and look at more closely. But there is no Jew nor Greek, there is no slave nor free, there is no male and female. Now just notice that the same sort of dichotomy that we had in the prayer of Plato or the early rabbinic prayer, it looks like all three dichotomies are overcome. You don't say, I'm glad I'm a Jew, not a Greek. I'm glad I'm a slave, not free, not a slave. I'm glad I'm male, not female. That's all done away with in Christ. There's a new basis for equality. You could argue that the basis for that is a reading of Genesis, which accepts that men and women are alike created in the image of God. The creation story from Genesis is going to come up later, where it's used to insist that women must not be teachers because Eve was deceived. But it's important to emphasize that in the very first account of the creation of humankind, God says, let us make Adam, mankind. Not just Adam, but this is a common noun for humankind. Let us make Adam in our image. Let them have dominion. That is, Adam is not just Adam, the guy. It's not that Adam gets dominion. And the verse continues, so God created Adam in his image. Does that mean just the guy Adam? No, it means humankind. You can tell that because of the next sentence. In the image of God, God created them. Male and female, he created them. In other words, in this verse at least, it's not true for Genesis 2, but in this verse, Adam is not one of the two folk. Adam is humankind, and male and female are both Adam. Both are equally in the image of God. Now again, to be fair, in Genesis 2, Isha, woman, comes out of Ish, man. And there is a sense that man is created and woman is extracted from him. We'll get to that in a while. So we have here sort of an exegetical basis for the idea that God made this strangely diverse, sexually bimorphic humanity in God's own image. And that means there's a place of perhaps equality for women. I just want to explore a moment more some of these roles that Paul ascribes to women.